Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Gupta, and we are talking about threads of threads of exploration, visual exploration, textiles and allied practices. Now here, in the last lecture, we have ended our discussion on this particular kind of cotton fabric, which is called muslin, in which the thread count can go up to 1000, and for that reason, which is also this fabric has also been known as woven air. Now what we find that how this kind of fabric is then sort of implemented back on the paintings or in the visual representations. In the left side of the screen, we have an image of Shah Jahan, and this is an image which was drawn in the Mughal court and by Muhammad Abid, who was a son of Akhariza, and then this painting is done in the early 17th century. And in this one, what we find here is that Shah Jahan is wearing an angrakha or a jama, which is this long, which starts from the shoulder and then it sort of flows until the knee or like beneath the knees, and where we find that he's shown here wearing this jama, but this jama is almost transparent. In the upper body we can almost see part of his body, this tone of his skin and everything else, but still he is wearing the jama. And then in the lower body we can very well see the pajama, which is there. This purplish tone of the pajama is also revealed through this jama, which is there on the top layer of it. So this sheer quality, this diaphanous quality of the fabric is something that we find that is there in this portrait was achievable only because of this kind of muslin. So the muslin that we have on screen in the right side, in which we can see that if a hand is passed through this layer of muslin cloth, then the hand with its color and everything is revealed through its layer. And similar kind of character we can also find that to be there in this miniature painting, which was made more than 300 years from today, and in which one we find that how this sheer quality, this diaphanous nature of the fabric is exemplified. Now we also need to understand that if we are talking about this particular kind of cotton, it does not mean that this kind of cotton was available to everyone. So this is a very specific kind of cotton which was only made in part of the eastern India, mostly in Bengal. So that means that it is not something that was easily available to most of the people in Bengal. This very specialized mean of cotton production, this muslin production, went side by side with many other production of coarse cotton, and that's the reason what we find here is this very specialized this cotton production, muslin production, was reserved for the highest of the authority, and that's the reason we do not really see this kind of muslin cloth is being worn by the people who will be working in the agricultural field, or even the local zamindars or the landlords and people like them. So if this is one of the things we find, we also see that Bengal in the 16th and 17th century was one of the highest revenue generating state for the Mughals. So for that reason, flaunting their dominance over Bengal is something that is also implied through having this very expensive and super specialized muslin cloth on their body and being featured in this miniature painting. So having this particular kind of fabric in this painting is not coincidental. It is not something that we can consider to be just a choice, but it was a very conscious choice for the emperors, also for the artist, to proclaim certain this political aspects of the Mughal rule, that how Bengal was under the dominance of the Mughals during that time. And then the most precious, perhaps the most precious textile that came from Bengal is then we find that to be reserved for the highest of the authority of the Mughal rule. So in this ways we find that how this material we are talking about, if we go with the thread count which can go between like 500 to 1000, and how that kind of material quality, and then the technique of spinning and weaving and then making muslin or woven air is something that is, it has its one aspect that is related to the technicalities, materiality and everything else. On the other hand, we find that to be how the skill of particularly making this kind of yarn is there. It's a very specialized kind of skill. We are talking about the local knowledge, but then the local knowledge and then the material, technique, all of them are then connected to the state politics, and then how all those things kind of come up in the visual representation, or the visual representation bear certain indication towards all these complicated relationships, and in which we find that the cotton fabric is there present, but then the cotton fabric is present here as a reminder of all these different kind of relationships between material, technique, skill, knowledge system, politics, culture and so on. So that is how we can also see that how textile, starting with the materiality of the textile can lead us to understanding the larger patterns of societal and cultural flow. So after cotton we talk about silk fiber, and in silk fiber we, as I have already mentioned, that silk is something that is extracted from animals. It is a protein based fiber, unlike cellulose based fiber. So cellulose based fiber as cotton is something that is one of the hardest fibers to dye, and then silk and wool will find that to be much more receptive to dyes. So what happens with silk production? So silk production, we find that from the northeastern region in India had been active in making silk. As Stephen Cohen, textile scholar, he argues or he proposes that how for the at least for the last 3 millennia or even more than that, there were silk production northeastern parts of India. Now in terms of silk production, what we find that to be there is that the broad generalization is that the mulberry silk that was mostly cultivated in China, that showed the path to the other Asian countries for making silk, and including the Indian subcontinent. However, some of the early specimens which were found from northeastern India that had shown that it's not the mulberry silk which was primarily found from the northeastern regions, but it was much more kind of the wild silk like the eri, muga and so on. So those kind of silk, what we find that to be there in the northeastern states. Now after that, there are also some of the also some of the other specimens which are found from the Indus Valley sites as well. So it is not quite clear if the Indus Valley sites, they had silk production units there, or the silk arrived from somewhere else in the Indian subcontinent. However, it also shows that how the silk production was active in various parts of the Indian subcontinent, even in the 3rd millennia BC. And so so if this is something we find that to be there, and mostly what happens in terms of the mulberry silk production, something that we see there is that in the silk moths, the silkworms are sort of fed this mulberry leaves, and that is how that is how silk has been harvested for millennia. And this is one of the predominant ways of harvesting silk that we find in China as well. In the agricultural fields and all, we will have the mulberry trees in the fields and so on, and where alongside agriculture, the silk or the sericulture would also take place, something we also find today in India as well. And after this silkworms would feed into this mulberry leaves, and then they will form this cocoon, and this cocoons, we find it here in the left side of the screen, in which we see that there is this structure made of bamboo, and in which as many as cocoons that we can see them to be there, that can be sort of kept, and then these cocoons are allowed to sort of form this protective sort of a surface, or a protective layer around them, and this fibery layer that we find that to be there is the base of the silk. Now once this silk formation is done, then these cocoons are then boiled in water, and that is how of course this silkworms, they die, but then cocoons, the silk is extracted, this fiber is extracted. So with this fiber extraction, what we find that the fiber which is there on the outer layer of the cocoon is usually made into raw silk, and then the fiber that is there in the inner part of the cocoon is something that is used for the finer silk. So processes we also find that to be there in mostly how silk extraction process is sort of followed throughout. Now one of the very specific kind of silk we also find that to be there, that is called the airy silk, and airy silk is something that is called the ahimsa silk, in which the silk, these worms are allowed to sort of get out of this cocoon, and then the silk is extracted from it. These creatures, they do not die, and so that's the reason it is called as ahimsa silk. And how that is how this production process is different from the other much more sort of the predominant means of silk production. Now in the right side of the image, we also find that there is this yarn making which is going on here. So after this particular way in which this fiber is extracted from this worms, the silkworms, and then it also sort of goes through the process of cleaning, and then finally when we have the fiber being ready to be spun, and then there's also sort of spun in the spindle, different kind of spindle that can be, and then the yarns are sort of made there. So a lot of times we find that for silk, it depends on what kind of worm we are talking about. Based on that, we have also different varieties of silk, and also different kind of color we also find it there. So for example, here we have a number of different silk fibers, and then how the silk, this yarns are produced out of the fibers. So and this images, they come from the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum, and in the side we have some of the varieties of the wild silk, as well as the cultivated silk. And one can see here that how here this particular kind of silk, the luster of it, or the shine in it, is something that sort of sets it apart from the cotton yarn. So those kind of things we will find that it's not just the shine, but it's also the tactile quality of it. Also at the same time how this fiber would behave when we sort of make into a wearable fabric. All those things depend on the nature of this yarn. And as I have already mentioned, that the visual characteristic is not something that is separated from its material characteristics. So these issues can be sort of also read into there. Now here, if we compare this, the kind of this the evenness in the fibers, or the yarn that we see here in this particular formation, and how that is different from the yarn formation here. It is much more kind of crimp, and much more sort of this is not really as fine as the one that we have in the left side of this image. So all these different kinds of silk we find that to be there, and as I have mentioned that there are many different kinds of silk, like the mulberry silk, airy silk, muga silk, tussar silk. So all those different kinds of silk all are extracted from this silkworms. They would result into different kinds of fiber, and eventually leading towards making different kinds of fabric. So today what we find that there are many different areas in the Indian subcontinent where silk production takes place, and then the mulberry silk production is something that certainly is the predominant one, and that's something we find that to be part of in eastern India, in Bengal, in Bihar, Jharkhand, Orissa, and so on, and then in southern India and part of it. Then we also have in Madhya Pradesh the use of silk and everything else, those are there. Now silk is something we as I have mentioned that there are many these varieties of the fibers that see there, and then if we think about that how this varieties of fiber can lead towards different kinds of cloth, that example of that we can see in the right side of the screen. And in the right side of the screen we have this Tasar weft ikat, that is this one from Nuapatna in Odisha, in which one we see that the Tasar silk, this unevenness of the Tasar silk, or perhaps the kind of one can see each and every fiber of it. So those things we can certainly see that there in this Tasar silk, this stole, and how that Tasar silk is different from the airy silk of Kachar and Assam. So the airy silk that here, and this is something that is different from how the Tasar is there. And then of course we also have the Muga silk from Guwahati, and Assam is known for its Muga silk, and of course airy silk as well, but also very much known for the Muga silk and how the wearables are made from it. If we also make a comparison between how this three varieties of silk that we have on screen are there presented here, we can also see the kind of fold, the crump and everything else that is there possible perhaps in this Muga silk will not be the same way if we think about the Tasar silk from Nuapatna in Odisha. So those also add to these are not just some material characteristic, but they add tremendously to the entire aesthetics also at the same time, how it will appear once someone wears it. So with this discussions on silk, we will go back to this image that we have already studied, and that is the portrait of Shah Jahan. So if we have one part of the fabric, that is this jama that he wears on his body, that is made of this fine Bengal muslin, then something we find that to be there that is made of silk, and that is the sash. Of course he also wears this this woven silk pajama that is there, this bright purple color pajama. But what I wanted to sort of focus on this particular sash or patka that we find that to be there on his waist, and the ends of it is hanging, right? So this is something that we have, the sash is also it's a wearable for men, and we find that to be there very much in fashion during the early modern period in the Indian subcontinent. So in the Mughal court we find that sash or patka is something that is worn by the courtiers, and of course the royals. And in this one we find that how sash is sort of tied in the waist, and it is not just for tying and for just as a fashion statement, but it is also used for holding certain things. So for example, we find this bejeweled dagger which is also tied to this sash in the waistline. Sometimes this waistcloth is also used for keeping money and other important resources which can be sort of pulled inside this sash. So if this is something we find that to be there, and then what are the other characteristics we find in the sash? We see that of course these two ends are hanging, and in these two ends we have also a lot of detailed motifs. So in the right side of the screen I wanted to show this another sash, and that is it's a sash with a floral border, and in which both silk and cotton is used in its warp and weft, and then silk threads are then used for making the embroidered motifs that appear on the border here. So the floral motifs that we find that to be there on the border, and then the continuous creeper motifs that sort of like run across this, so those characteristics we definitely find them to be there featured in this sash as well, in which we find that clear there are like continuous borders which are running there, and in some cases we also find that how there would be like extra set of decorations or ornamentations featured in the ends of the sash. So something that we have in this one in the right side of the screen. So this is something we find that how putting this object right beside the visual representation of the object can make us think about its larger relevance, and then like thinking about not only just as a fashion understanding like what is the fashion during this time period, what is prioritized, what is not, but also that how different kinds of making this fabric, or like different kinds of using them, they also contribute a lot to the overall aesthetics of this particular kinds of cloth. Now to continue on that, I wanted to show the entire sash that we have already seen in the earlier picture. Now why there is why there is a requirement for looking at this sash as just one untailored piece of fabric, and then like looking at it as something that is tied on the waistline, right? So with that, what happens is that when we see this one untailored piece of fabric with like this continuous borders here, and then like the extra ornamentation in these two edges, with those ones what we find that how the material made in the workshops of the makers, the embroiders, then how this fabric is like when it is made, the wearer's perspective was already taken into account, that the edges, these two edges of it, like these two edges would be like hanging from the waist, and that's the reason like these two edges would be visible to the viewers. And since like sash is something that is like sort of tied in the waist, then like any decoration which comes perhaps in the middle of the cloth will not be visible to anyone, and that is the reason the middle portion and most of the part of this fabric has been left without much decoration. It is not the same for all sashes, but mostly we will find that how there is always stress on this continuous borders and the edges which would be hanging, and that also something that talks about how the aesthetics of sash is also intertwined with the utilitarian aspect of sash. And here I just wanted to show this one sash. Of course, like this is the detail from the one we have already studied, in which we see that how the silk threads are very carefully employed with like the color variation and everything to show this marigold flowers, and then how the floral motifs are very carefully sort of selected and put forward in the edges of this sash. With that, we also look into that the other kind of silk thread which is much employed in brocade silk weaving and also for embroidery and so on, and that we understand as zari, or the metal wrapped silk thread. So in this case, what happens, we find that there are metal, so for example there can be gold, silver, copper and so on, and when metal is heated, then there are ways in which like how the metal is pulled from like the entire matrix, and then like the pulling of the metal from it when it is heated, when it is molten, and then what happens is like one can see that the wear formation that takes place for its elasticity. Then when this very thin wares are produced, then it is immediately wrapped around the silk thread, and then like that is how the zari threads are produced. So in this case, what happens, we see that the zari threads are something that sort of like it has a silk core, and then like the silk core would be like wrapped with this metallic threads. So there are two kinds of like wrapping that we also find that to be there, at least what like Stephen Cohen and Rosemary Krill, they also suggest that one is like a Z or Z and the other one is like S. So imagine, like, I mean, if if this is the silk thread, and then, like, I mean, the metal thread is sort of, like, I mean, wrapped like this, which is anti-clockwise, then that is called the Z sort of wrapping. And then in the other way, in which, like, I mean, this clockwise wrapping is done, and that is the one which is the S kind of, like, I mean, wrapping. Now in these two cases, what we find that in the mostly in the North Indian samples, and many of the samples which are found from Deccan and also part of southern India, follow this Z kind of metal wire wrapping. However, the ones which we find in Iran and part of Middle East, in which we find that the S kind of curve is shown. Now for the S curve, we also find that, I mean, in many of the Deccani and South Indian specimens would also feature this kind of S curve zari threads. And the zari threads are something that we find that, I mean, if one of the ways in incorporating metal is to have, like, I mean, this zari threads, there are also other ways in which we find that the different kinds of metallic embellishments are employed in making threads. So for example, the one we have in the left side of the screen, we have that, I mean, there are different kinds of, like, I mean, bits of metal, and then, like, I mean, perhaps sometime, like, I mean, pieces of metal which are incorporated in making this kind of zari, of course, I mean, which are not really meant to be, like, I mean, worn directly on skin, but on the layer, on top of some other layer. However, like, I mean, how this kind of threads are also part of, like, I mean, making zari, and then the zari threads are also used in making this another very special embroidery technique that is called as zardozi, in which we find that there's different kind of, like, I mean, metal fragments, and then, like, pieces of metal and different kind of embellishments are the ones which would be incorporated there. Now in the side of the screen, we have another sash that comes from Deccan and from the 18th century, and I'll just go through its and comes from the Museum of Fine Arts Boston's collection. And in this one, I'll just go through the specificities of its technique. So it is cotton plain weave with silk and gold colored metal strip wrapped on silk core embroidery, silk couched metallic yarns and metallic fringes. So what we have here, that, I mean, there is cotton plain weave that is there in the body, but then, like, I mean, the embroidery is done with, like, I mean, silk yarn, but at the same time, like, I mean, the zari yarn, in which, like, I mean, we have the gold colored metal strips, and then, like, I mean, of course, the zari yarn, which is also gold colored, and then those all are then employed for making the embroidery. Now we also find this the metallic fringes, which are then attached at the end of this fabric. That is something that we find, that how this zari is used not extensively in the embroidery but also in the fringes. And fringes is something we can also imagine that if the ends of the sash is hanging from the waistline, then the fringes would also be very much visible. So for making like, I mean, drawing attraction to that, we find how this zari threads can be useful for it. So this is again going back to this idea about, like, I mean, how utility, aesthetics and making of these textiles all are interconnected, and these different kinds of material which are used for making this one piece of fabric are also very much strategic, and it's never really coincidental. Thank you. We'll talk about the other materials in the next lecture.